The private jet shuddered violently in midair when both the captain and the first officer collapsed within minutes of each other, victims of a medical emergency no one saw coming. Alarms screamed through the cabin, red lights flashing across every panel, and Vivian Sterling, the chief executive of Sterling Dynamics Aerospace, went pale as a flight attendant shouted into the cabin, asking if anyone on board knew how to fly a plane. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then, from the back row, a man in a worn leather jacket rose quietly and walked toward the cockpit without a trace of panic on his face. He said only one sentence before stepping through the door. "Open the cockpit." No one believed that quiet, unremarkable man could save more than 30 lives at 41,000 feet. Not until air traffic control spoke his name over the radio, and the entire cabin went silent. 3 hours earlier, the jet had been nothing but a symbol of comfort and power, gliding out of Denver into a clear autumn sky bound for Seattle. Elias Rowan boarded last, carrying a single canvas bag and a company-issued ticket that had been handed to him almost as an afterthought. He wore a plain jacket, faded jeans, and boots that had clearly seen years of wear, nothing like the tailored suits filling the rest of the cabin. 2 junior executives glanced at him and assumed he was maintenance staff, someone sent along to inspect an instrument panel or sign off on a technical report. Vivian barely looked up from her tablet. Already 3 video calls deep into a merger negotiation that mattered more to her than anything happening around her, she offered him a brief, distracted nod and returned to her screen, filing him away as background noise. Trevor Nash, the company's operations director, made no effort to hide his irritation. He leaned toward an assistant and muttered that it was strange to put a technician on the executive jet, as if a working man in plain clothes somehow lowered the value of the cabin around him. Elias heard the comment and said nothing, choosing instead to settle into his seat near the rear and pull out a folder of technical documents. He read with the quiet focus of someone who had spent a lifetime studying systems most people never thought about: hydraulic diagrams, pressure charts, engine schematics marked with small, precise notes in his own handwriting. Nobody in that cabin understood how deeply he knew the machine carrying them through the sky. And nobody yet understood what price he had once paid for that knowledge. He simply sat there, calm and unnoticed, while the engines climbed toward cruising altitude and the last ordinary minutes of the flight slipped quietly away. Across the aisle, a young analyst named Kelly Preston tried to strike up polite conversation, asking Elias what department he worked in and whether he traveled often with the executive team. He answered simply that he consulted on flight systems from time to time, offering nothing more, his tone neither cold nor inviting further questions. Kelly shrugged and returned to her own paperwork, assuming she had guessed correctly that he belonged somewhere in the lower rungs of the corporate structure. Nearby, 2 junior directors traded quiet jokes about the informality of his clothing, careful to keep their voices low enough that they assumed he could not hear them. Elias heard every word and let it pass through him without leaving a mark, long practiced in the art of being underestimated. He had learned years earlier that the sky did not care what a man wore or what others thought of him, only what he understood about the machine keeping him alive, and that understanding was something no tailored suit could replace. Vivian, meanwhile, remained locked in her negotiation, her voice sharp and commanding, as she pushed back against a counterpart on the screen who was trying to shave percentage points off a deal she had spent months assembling. She barely registered the cabin around her, treating the flight the way she treated most things in her life, as simply another space to be productive in, another hour to be optimized. Somewhere beneath her composure, though, a faint unease had settled after boarding, the kind of feeling she usually dismissed as fatigue or stress rather than instinct. She glanced briefly toward the rear of the cabin, her eyes passing over Elias without registering him at all, then returned to the glowing screen in front of her. It was the last ordinary decision she would make for many hours. An unremarkable dismissal that would later feel, in hindsight, like the beginning of everything that followed. Somewhere over the mountains, the plane hit its first stretch of turbulence, gentle at first, barely enough to rattle a coffee cup resting on a tray table. A few passengers glanced up from their laptops, mildly annoyed, then returned to their work as the aircraft steadied again. Elias did not look up from his folder. but something in the rhythm of the vibration made him pause for half a second longer than anyone else in the cabin. He had felt turbulence like that before, years earlier, in cockpits far less comfortable than this one, and some old instinct inside him quietly stirred awake. Outside the windows, clouds began to thicken along the horizon, gray and heavy, gathering the kind of weight that experienced pilots learn to respect. The calm of the flight was ending. Though no one aboard, not even Elias, yet knew how quickly everything was about to change. The storm arrived faster than the forecast had predicted, rolling in from the west with sudden, aggressive turbulence that forced the flight attendants to strap in immediately. Captain Grant Holloway handled the shift with practiced calm, adjusting altitude and course exactly as his training demanded, his voice steady over the intercom as he reassured the passengers that everything remained under control. For a few minutes, it seemed like nothing more than a rough patch of weather, the kind every frequent flyer had experienced a dozen times before. Then, without warning, Grant's hand froze on the controls, his face contorting in sudden pain as his heart seized beneath his uniform. First Officer Miles Donovan reacted instantly, taking over the controls and calling for medical assistance, his voice tight but controlled as he tried to keep the aircraft level through the worsening turbulence. For a few critical minutes, Miles held the plane steady almost single-handedly, fighting the crosswinds while simultaneously trying to monitor his captain's collapsed body on the cockpit floor. But the same pressure irregularity that had triggered Grant's cardiac event was quietly working against Miles as well, starving his brain of the oxygen it needed at that altitude. His vision blurred, his hands grew heavy on the yoke, and within minutes he too slumped forward, unconscious, leaving the aircraft without a single person at the controls. The plane began to drift, nose tilting downward ever so slightly, engines humming on their own without guidance. In the cabin, the change in cabin pressure and the sudden dip in altitude sent a wave of nausea and fear through the passengers, several of them gripping their armrests as gasps rippled down the aisle. Inside the cabin, the sudden shift in altitude sent trays and glasses sliding across tables, and a low, collective gasp rippled through the rows as passengers gripped their armrests. Kelly Preston clutched the seat in front of her, her knuckles white, while the two junior directors who had joked about Elias only an hour earlier now sat frozen, all humor drained from their faces. Somewhere near the front, a woman began praying quietly under her breath, her voice barely audible over the whine of the engines and the rattle of loose objects rolling across the floor. The aircraft dipped again, sharper this time, and the overhead compartments groaned under the strain, one popping open to spill a jacket into the aisle. Vivian's laptop slid from her tray table and crashed to the floor, forgotten entirely as the reality of the situation finally broke through the wall of professional focus she had maintained since boarding. A flight attendant burst from the front galley, her professional composure cracking as she scanned the rows of frightened faces. Her voice cut through the cabin, desperate and raw. "Is there anyone who can fly this plane?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. And for several agonizing seconds, absolutely no one answered. Executives who negotiated billion-dollar contracts sat frozen, unable to offer anything but silence. Vivian felt her chest tighten as panic clawed its way up her throat, her mind racing through every worst-case scenario a CEO is trained to prepare for, none of which had ever included this. She looked around at her colleagues, searching for someone, anyone, capable of stepping forward, and found only fear staring back at her. Then, quietly, from the rear of the cabin, a man began to rise from his seat. Elias moved down the aisle with a calm that felt almost unnatural given the chaos surrounding him, his eyes already assessing the tilt of the aircraft and the sound of the engines with practiced precision. The flight attendant blocked his path instinctively, her training telling her to verify credentials before allowing anyone near the cockpit, especially someone she had assumed was simply a technician along for the ride. Trevor stepped in front of him as well, his voice sharp with the kind of authority he was used to wielding in boardrooms, demanding to know what qualifications this stranger possibly had to justify touching the controls of a multi-million-dollar aircraft. Elias did not raise his voice or argue his case at length. He looked Trevor directly in the eyes and said only that there was no time left for questions. Behind him, the plane shuddered again, more violently this time, and several passengers screamed as the nose dipped further. Vivian hesitated only a moment longer, torn between corporate liability instincts and the simple, terrifying truth that someone had to act immediately. The aircraft lurched downward once more, hard enough to send a laptop crashing to the floor and knock a service cart sideways in the aisle. Something in her broke through the hesitation, and she shouted over the noise for the crew to open the cockpit door and let the man through. Elias moved past Trevor without another word, stepping into the cramped, alarm-filled cockpit where two unconscious pilots lay slumped against their harnesses. He gently pulled Grant back from the controls, checked Miles's pulse with practiced fingers, and then turned his full attention to the instrument panel glowing red and amber with warnings. His hands found the controls as if he had never left them, adjusting throttle, correcting pitch, and silencing alarms one by one with a fluency that suggested decades of muscle memory rather than mere technical knowledge. Behind him, the flight attendant pulled the cockpit door nearly shut, though it could not fully close over the tangle of instruments and the two unconscious men still being tended to on the floor. Dr. Naomi Pierce arrived moments later, pushing past startled passengers with the calm urgency of someone trained for exactly this kind of crisis, and knelt beside Grant to check his pulse and airway. She confirmed quietly that his heart had likely stopped briefly before restarting on its own, and that both he and Miles needed immediate medical attention the moment the aircraft reached the ground. Elias acknowledged her with a single nod, his attention never leaving the instruments, trusting her completely to manage what he no longer had the capacity to handle himself. Naomi began administering what care she could with the limited supplies on board, working in the cramped space between the cockpit and the galley, while the aircraft continued to shudder around them. It was, in its own way, a second quiet act of courage unfolding alongside the first, one that would go largely unnoticed amid the drama playing out at the controls. Within seconds, the wild pitching of the aircraft began to smooth into something more controlled, though the storm outside still battered the fuselage with relentless turbulence. The radio crackled to life, a controller's voice cutting through static, demanding identification from whoever now occupied the captain's seat. Elias keyed the microphone and responded with a string of precise aviation terminology, altitude figures, airspeed corrections, and system diagnostics delivered in the clipped, confident cadence of someone who had spoken this exact language 1,000 times before. There was a pause on the other end, a silence heavy enough that even the passengers pressed near the cockpit door could sense it. Then the controller's voice returned, quieter, almost disbelieving, asking a single question that would change everything. "Captain Rowan, is that you?" The name hit the cabin like a physical shock, rippling backward from the cockpit through rows of stunned executives who had, only minutes earlier, dismissed this man as invisible. Vivian's breath caught in her throat as pieces of forgotten industry rumors began to surface in her memory, fragments of a name she had heard whispered years before in aerospace circles. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory sharpened into focus, a legendary test pilot who had vanished from public life after a devastating tragedy no one spoke about openly. The passengers who understood aviation history exchanged wide-eyed glances, murmuring the name as though testing whether it could possibly be true. Elias, however, gave no reaction to the recognition in the controller's voice. His focus entirely locked on the instruments in front of him and the storm still raging outside the windows. He had more than 9,000 hours of flight time behind him, a career built on testing aircraft most pilots never even saw, and years spent training elite pilots for both NASA and the United States Air Force, but none of that mattered now, except as it applied to the task in front of him. Vivian sat frozen in her seat, staring toward the cockpit as though seeing the entire flight for the first time, the dismissive nod she had given him hours earlier now feeling unbearably small. She had built her career on reading people quickly, on sizing up talent and potential within seconds of a handshake. And yet she had walked past one of the most accomplished aviators in the country without a second glance. Shame mixed uncomfortably with fear inside her chest, though there was no time to dwell on either emotion as the aircraft shuddered again, this time from something mechanical rather than atmospheric. A warning light flared across the cockpit panel, hydraulic pressure dropping in one of the primary systems, and Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he began working through the emergency checklist from memory. Outside, the storm showed no sign of relenting. And somewhere, beneath the aircraft, the ground waited, unaware of the quiet battle now unfolding thousands of feet above it. The hydraulic failure complicated everything, stripping away part of the aircraft's responsiveness at the exact moment the storm intensified around them. Crosswinds slammed against the fuselage with brutal, unpredictable force, forcing Elias to compensate manually for systems that should have adjusted automatically under normal circumstances. Fuel reserves were already limited, calculated for a direct flight to Seattle rather than an emergency diversion through hostile weather, and every minute spent fighting the storm burned through options that could not be replaced. Elias worked the controls with a steady, economical precision, his eyes flicking between the instrument panel and the churning gray clouds outside the windshield, never allowing his hands to betray the tension building in his shoulders. Behind him, through the open cockpit door, Vivian watched in stunned silence, gripping the doorframe as the aircraft bucked and steadied beneath his guidance. Air traffic control relayed updated weather data, their voices carrying the clipped professionalism of people trained not to alarm anyone, but unable entirely to mask their concern. One controller, coordinating with emergency services on the ground, estimated their odds of a safe landing at barely 5% given the combination of limited visibility, mechanical failure, and a runway already slick with rain. The number reached the cabin somehow, passed in a whisper from one passenger to another, and a heavy silence settled over the rows of executives who moments earlier had been consumed by spreadsheets and quarterly projections. Vivian felt something shift inside her as she watched Elias work, his hands never trembling despite the storm and the numbers stacked against them. For the first time since boarding, she allowed herself to believe, however cautiously, that the man in the worn jacket might actually bring them home alive. Just as the aircraft began to find a fragile rhythm beneath the storm, a new alarm blared across the panel, an engine fire warning flashing bright red beside the number 2 turbine indicator. Elias's eyes narrowed as he cross-checked the readings against the temperature gauges and exhaust data, refusing to react on instinct alone despite the urgency of the alert. Within seconds, he determined the warning was a false positive, triggered by a faulty sensor rather than an actual fire, and calmly reset the system while continuing to hold the aircraft steady through the worsening turbulence. The moment of clarity offered no real relief, however, because the storm outside had grown even more violent, and the aircraft groaned under stress it had not been designed to endure for this long. Somewhere behind him, Trevor leaned toward the cockpit doorway, his earlier hostility now buried beneath something closer to desperate curiosity, and asked the question that had been building in everyone's mind since the controller had spoken that name. The cabin had grown eerily quiet in the minutes following the false alarm, passengers watching the cockpit doorway as though it were a stage upon which their survival was being decided. Vivian had moved closer, standing just behind the threshold where she could see Elias's hands moving across the panel with an economy of motion that reminded her, oddly, of watching a concert pianist who no longer needed to look at the keys. She found herself studying him differently now, searching his face for some sign of the fear she assumed must be hiding beneath his composure, and finding instead only concentration. It occurred to her, in that strange, suspended moment, that she had spent her entire career surrounded by people performing confidence, and that this was the first time she had witnessed the real thing. The thought unsettled her more than the storm itself, because it forced her to confront how thoroughly she had misjudged the man standing only a few feet away. "If you're really that skilled," Trevor asked, his voice tight with disbelief, "why were you sitting in the back of this plane pretending to be nobody?" Elias did not look away from the instruments as he answered, his words measured and economical, offering only the essential outline of a story he clearly had no intention of expanding upon under pressure. He had once been considered among the finest test pilots in the country, a man trusted with aircraft still years from public release, admired by colleagues who assumed his career would only climb higher. Then came an accident during a routine flight years earlier, one that claimed the life of his wife and stripped away every reason he once had to chase the sky. He had walked away from aviation entirely after that, choosing instead a quiet life, inspecting flight systems from the ground, never again touching the controls of an aircraft in the air. Vivian listened from the doorway, and something inside her recalibrated completely. The arrogance she had carried onto this flight replaced by a quiet, uncomfortable respect for a man she had failed to see clearly, even once. The storm eased slightly as the aircraft descended toward more stable air, though the reprieve offered little comfort given the mounting fuel crisis now flashing steadily on the cockpit display. Elias calculated the remaining reserves with practice speed, cross-referencing distance to the nearest suitable runway against burn rates that had climbed sharply during the extended emergency. 12 minutes of fuel remained, a number that left no room for hesitation, indecision, or a second attempt if the first approach failed. He relayed the figure to air traffic control in a flat, businesslike tone, requesting immediate clearance and emergency support at the nearest airport capable of handling a jet in their condition. On the ground, controllers scrambled to reroute traffic and alert emergency crews, their voices growing more urgent as the window for a safe landing narrowed with each passing second. Inside the cabin, passengers who had spent the flight watching quarterly reports now stared instead at their trembling hands, silently praying that the quiet man in the cockpit could finish what he had started. Ground crews at the nearest airport moved with practiced urgency, clearing runways and positioning fire trucks and ambulances along the tarmac as controllers guided the crippled aircraft toward final approach. Rain slicked the runway in dark, reflective sheets, and gusting crosswinds continued to buffet the fuselage even as the storm technically began to weaken above them. Elias fought the controls through the descent, compensating constantly for the reduced hydraulic responsiveness while watching the altimeter unwind toward the ground with unforgiving speed. One engine sputtered briefly, its performance destabilized by the earlier false alarm and the accumulated stress of the flight, forcing him to adjust throttle inputs by feel rather than by any manual procedure. Behind him, Vivian gripped a seat back and closed her eyes for just a moment, whispering something that sounded less like a prayer and more like an apology to a man who could not hear her over the roar of the engines. Through the windshield, the runway lights finally emerged from the gray haze, a thin necklace of white and amber, cutting through the rain like a promise. Elias adjusted his approach with small, deliberate corrections, fighting a crosswind that tried repeatedly to shove the nose off center as the ground rushed closer. In the cabin, the flight attendants moved quickly through the brace positions, their voices steady despite the fear etched across their faces, guiding passengers through instructions most of them had never expected to need. Vivian gripped the doorframe of the cockpit, unwilling to return to her seat, needing somehow to witness whatever was about to happen rather than wait for it blindly. Naomi held Miles steady on the floor beside her, bracing his body as best she could, while Grant remained still, breathing shallow but alive. The final seconds stretched impossibly long, the altimeter counting down toward zero as the runway lights blurred into streaks of light against the rain-soaked glass. The runway rose to meet them fast, faster than any of the passengers braced for impact were prepared for, and the aircraft's wheels struck the wet pavement with a jolt hard enough to rattle every window in the cabin. Elias fought to keep the nose straight as the plane skidded across the slick surface, brakes screaming against water and friction, while the aircraft slid several hundred meters further than a normal landing would ever allow. For a few terrifying seconds, it seemed the jet might overrun the runway entirely. But Elias never released his grip on the controls, never allowed panic to override the discipline built over decades of training. Slowly, agonizingly, the aircraft shuddered to a final stop just short of the runway's edge, engines winding down into an eerie, exhausted silence. For a moment, no one in the cabin moved, the shock of survival settling over them like a physical weight before the first sob broke free somewhere near the front rows. Then the cabin erupted. Passengers weeping, embracing strangers, some simply staring blankly at the man who had walked out of the cockpit, still wearing his worn leather jacket, utterly unchanged by what he had just accomplished. Paramedics rushed onto the tarmac within minutes, wheeling stretchers toward the aircraft while fire crews swept the perimeter, checking for any lingering danger from the earlier engine warning. Grant and Miles were carried off first, both stable but still unconscious, Naomi walking alongside the stretchers and relaying details of their condition to the waiting medical teams. Passengers filed down the emergency slide one by one, some laughing with the giddy relief of survival, others crying openly, clutching strangers who only hours earlier had been nothing more than fellow travelers. Elias remained near the aircraft longer than anyone else, speaking quietly with airport officials and confirming technical details of the flight before finally stepping onto solid ground himself. He accepted a blanket from a paramedic out of politeness rather than need, his eyes scanning the wreckage of tension still visible on the faces around him. It was only once he was certain every passenger, every crew member, and both pilots were safely accounted for, that something in his shoulders finally seemed to loosen. In the hours following the emergency landing, as paramedics tended to Grant and Miles and investigators began combing through the aircraft systems, Vivian retreated to a quiet corner of the terminal and opened her tablet to search for the name that had saved her life. What she found reshaped everything she thought she understood about the man in the leather jacket, revealing a history far larger than a single extraordinary flight. Elias had not merely flown aircraft during his military career, he had helped design several flight control systems still in use today, holding numerous patents that quietly influenced how modern jets responded to their pilots. Years earlier, he had reportedly turned down an offer to become chief executive of a major airline, choosing instead a life away from boardrooms and headlines entirely. The Federal Aviation Administration itself had, at one point, invited him to serve as a technical consultant, a role reserved for only the most trusted minds in aviation safety. She scrolled through old aviation forums and archived articles, piecing together a career that read almost like fiction, filled with achievements most pilots could only dream of attaining across an entire lifetime. There were photographs from years earlier. A younger Elias, standing beside experimental aircraft with a wide, easy grin, surrounded by engineers who clearly regarded him as something close to a prodigy. One article, buried deep in the search results, referenced the accident that had ended his public career, describing it only briefly and with the careful vagueness of a story the family involved had never wanted publicized. Vivian read the fragment twice, feeling a fresh wave of guilt settle over her, as she realized how much pain must have been folded quietly beneath the composed exterior she had witnessed in the cockpit. She closed the tablet slowly, no longer certain whether the man who had saved her life deserved gratitude alone, or something closer to genuine reverence for what he had survived long before that flight ever began. Sandra Cole, chairman of the board, arrived at the terminal within the hour, her expression a careful mixture of relief and disbelief as she embraced Vivian tightly before turning her attention toward Elias. She admitted, almost quietly, that the company had once spent nearly 8 years trying to recruit him, sending letters and offers that were always politely declined without explanation. Vivian stood in stunned silence as the weight of that revelation settled over her, realizing that the man she had barely acknowledged hours earlier had once been actively pursued by her own organization for nearly a decade. Something cold and uncomfortable twisted in her chest. Not merely embarrassment, but a deeper recognition of how easily she had let appearances dictate her judgment. She thanked him again, this time with genuine humility, rather than corporate formality, though Elias simply nodded and asked instead about the condition of the 2 pilots now receiving treatment nearby. His focus, even after everything, remained fixed on the people he had fought to save, rather than on any recognition being offered to him. As investigators began reviewing the aircraft's maintenance logs and sensor data, a troubling pattern started to emerge, one that suggested the failures aboard the flight had not been purely accidental. Technicians discovered that the maintenance schedule for the pressurization system had been altered shortly before departure, with entries that did not match the aircraft's actual service history. A pressure sensor, the very component believed responsible for triggering the oxygen deprivation that incapacitated both pilots, had been replaced using materials and procedures that violated standard safety protocols. Someone, it appeared, had deliberately cut corners, and the timing suggested an effort to conceal the alterations rather than simple negligence. Elias, still on site assisting investigators out of a quiet sense of duty rather than obligation, began cross-referencing digital maintenance records with physical inspection reports, uncovering discrepancies that pointed toward deliberate tampering rather than mechanical failure alone. What had begun as a story of survival was quickly becoming something far darker, a question of who inside Sterling Dynamics Aerospace had allowed, or perhaps orchestrated, the conditions for catastrophe. Federal investigators arrived within 2 days, working alongside the company's internal security team to trace the falsified entries back through months of maintenance logs and digital approval trails. Elias spent long hours in a windowless conference room with engineers, half his age, patiently explaining discrepancies in the data that even trained specialists had initially overlooked. He cross-referenced sensor batch numbers against supplier records, discovering that the replacement pressure sensor installed on the aircraft had never actually passed the certification testing required before installation. Someone had approved its use anyway, backdating a compliance report to make it appear as though proper procedure had been followed from the very beginning. The forgery was subtle, the kind of alteration that would likely have gone unnoticed, if not for Elias's insistence on checking the physical component serial numbers against the digital paperwork by hand. It was tedious, unglamorous work, nothing like the drama of the flight itself. Yet it mattered just as much, if not more, in preventing the next disaster before it could happen. The deeper the investigation dug, the more clearly Trevor Nash's name surfaced within the falsified records, his approval signature appearing on maintenance waivers that should never have been authorized. Financial records later revealed cost-cutting pressures Trevor had quietly imposed across several departments, pressures that had pushed maintenance teams to bypass proper procedures in order to meet unrealistic budget targets. Whether Trevor had acted with full knowledge of the risk or simply out of reckless indifference remained unclear. But the evidence against him mounted swiftly under the scrutiny of federal investigators now involved in the case. Elias worked alongside engineers and safety officials for days afterward, reconstructing flight data with a precision that impressed even seasoned federal inspectors accustomed to working with far less capable specialists. His name began circulating quietly through aviation safety circles once again, not as a legend from the past, but as a man whose expertise had proven indispensable in the present. Vivian watched from a distance as the company she had built her identity around began to reveal cracks she had never allowed herself to see clearly before. Determined to address the rot within her own organization, Vivian made the decision to overhaul internal safety protocols from the ground up, starting with a full external audit of every maintenance record across the fleet. She personally reviewed the findings each evening, staying long after her staff had gone home, driven by a discomfort that felt less like corporate liability and more like genuine guilt. The board grew increasingly supportive of her efforts once the scale of the falsified records became clear, understanding that the company's survival depended on rebuilding trust that had been quietly eroded for years. Sandra encouraged Vivian to consider bringing outside expertise into a formal advisory role. Someone with both the technical mastery and moral integrity to help guide the company through its recovery. There was only one name either of them considered seriously for the position, though neither expected he would easily agree to accept it. Vivian arranged a private meeting with Elias just days after the incident, uncertain whether he would even agree to speak with her again given how the company had once treated him. Vivian arrived at the small house Elias rented on the edge of town, a modest structure with a well-kept garden and a single bicycle leaning against the porch railing. He greeted her without ceremony, offering coffee in mismatched mugs and gesturing toward 2 wooden chairs on the porch rather than inviting her inside for anything more formal. She found herself oddly nervous, a feeling she rarely experienced anymore after years of commanding rooms full of far more intimidating people than one quiet former pilot. He listened patiently as she explained what the investigation had uncovered, his expression unreadable until she reached the part about Trevor's falsified approvals, at which point something hardened briefly in his eyes. When she finally asked what it would take to convince him to help the company rebuild its safety culture from the inside, he was quiet for a long moment, watching a pair of birds settle onto the fence at the edge of his yard. He told her he needed time to think, not because he doubted her sincerity, but because he had spent years deliberately staying away from exactly the kind of responsibility she was now offering him. Vivian stood before the full board of directors, and delivered an apology that surprised even those who knew her best, admitting openly that her leadership had allowed a culture of carelessness to take root within the company. She acknowledged that Trevor's actions, whatever his intentions, had only been possible because oversight structures meant to catch such failures had been weakened over time. Trevor was formally terminated that same week, his employment records and financial history handed over entirely to federal investigators pursuing charges related to falsified safety documentation. Sandra personally presented Elias with a formal commendation on behalf of the board, acknowledging publicly what the company had failed to acknowledge privately for nearly a decade. Days later, a letter arrived from the Federal Aviation Administration itself, thanking Elias for his conduct during the emergency, and quietly noting that his actions had likely prevented what could have become a devastating loss of life. Vivian read the letter twice before setting it aside and turning her attention to the conversation she had been preparing for since the moment the wheels touched the runway. She offered him the position of Director of Flight Safety, a role with significant authority, generous compensation, and a corner office reflecting the seniority the title implied. When he hesitated, she expanded the offer further, proposing that he also serve as strategic safety advisor to the executive board and lead a newly created pilot training program built around his own decades of experience. Elias listened carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than resistant, though it quickly became clear that the scale of the offer sat uneasily with the life he had deliberately built for himself after tragedy. He gently declined the executive titles, explaining that boardrooms and corner offices had never been what drew him back into aviation, even briefly, aboard that storm-battered flight. Instead, he agreed only to a modest advisory role, one that allowed him to shape safety standards and train new pilots without surrendering the quiet, unassuming life he had chosen years earlier. Vivian studied him for a long moment, understanding fully now what she had failed to see the first time they met. "Why?" she finally asked. "Would you risk everything to save people who once looked right through you without a second thought?" Elias considered the question for a moment, his eyes drifting briefly toward the window before he answered with the same quiet certainty that had guided him through every second of that flight. "When an aircraft is in the sky," he said, "there are no executives and no employees left inside it. Only human beings who need to be brought home safely." Vivian felt the weight of those words settle deeply within her, reshaping not just her understanding of Elias, but her understanding of leadership itself. In the weeks that followed, she began rebuilding the company's culture around that same simple principle, insisting that value be measured by character and competence rather than title or appearance. Meetings that once revolved entirely around profit margins now opened with safety briefings led personally by Elias, whose quiet authority carried more weight in that room than any executive title ever had. The first training session Elias led took place in a modest hangar rather than a polished conference room, a deliberate choice he insisted upon despite Vivian's initial suggestion of something grander. A dozen young pilots gathered around him as he walked through emergency procedures using the same calm, unhurried tone he had used in the cockpit months earlier, never raising his voice, never dramatizing the stakes beyond what the material itself demanded. He taught them not only the mechanics of flight, but the discipline of staying steady when everything around them threatened to unravel, a lesson no manual could fully capture on its own. Word of the program spread quickly through the industry, and soon pilots from other companies were requesting permission to attend, drawn by reputation rather than advertisement. Vivian sat in on several sessions herself, taking notes not on aviation but on leadership, absorbing lessons about patience and presence that she began quietly applying throughout the rest of her organization. Grant and Miles, both fully recovered within a few months, returned to active duty as well, insisting on completing Elias's training program before resuming their regular flight schedules, a gesture that meant more to him than either of them likely realized. Months later, the company that had once nearly lost everything stood transformed. Its safety record praised industry-wide, as a model other organizations began studying closely. Vivian led differently now, slower to judge, and quicker to listen, carrying with her always the memory of a man in a worn jacket she had almost overlooked entirely. Elias returned to the sky only occasionally, choosing his flights carefully, and never seeking the recognition that continued to follow him regardless of how quietly he tried to live. His reputation, once buried beneath years of self-imposed silence, had been fully restored, though he wore it the same way he wore everything else, without pride, without noise, simply as one more fact of a life rebuilt on his own terms. As dawn broke over a quiet runway one final morning, a single aircraft lifted gently into the pale gold light, climbing steadily into a clear and open sky. It rose not as a symbol of wealth or power, but as something far simpler, a quiet reminder that redemption, courage, and the chance to begin again could be found in the most unexpected of places, carried forward by the most unassuming of people.